Now with RFK Jr. as someone who Donald Trump has tapped as head of Health and Human Services, the left is freaking out over some of the things he has said in regard to our food supply and everything. They think he's kooky. Look, I think that there are certain things that he has said that I do not agree with. Okay, particularly when it comes to his claims about the downsides of vaccines, which have not been borne out in the research yet. However, I think he's totally right about things he has said about the damage we're causing to the environment, the toxicity of our food supply, the corruption within government agencies like the FDA. I mean, there's a reason why every other week we hear about a food recall because there's a listeria outbreak or an E. coli outbreak.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today, Ana Kasparian from the Young Turks. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Daniel?
Living the dream. You used my government name there.
Dan?
Transport. I don't care. I actually don't care. I just, people started calling me Dan because it's shorter, I think. And I'm like, all right, that's cool. I understand brevity. All right, let's start at the very beginning. Where are you from?
I am from Los Angeles, California. I was born and raised in LA, and I currently reside in LA.
Wow. Really adventurous. What did your parents do?
Well, my parents actually came here in, my dad in the late 1970s and my mom in the early 1980s as refugees from Soviet-controlled Armenia. And they are now, my parents are kind of retired. My mom worked as a teacher's assistant in the LAUSD system. And my father actually came here and started working at a welding company. And it was a great job. It was a unionized job. He had studied electrical engineering in Armenia, got his college degree in that area, but it didn't mean anything once he came to the United States. So he started working for a welding company, but unfortunately it was later outsourced, and he ended up working as a handyman. And that was enough for him to make a good, honest living. But I would venture to say that handymen are not able to do that these days, but that's what they did.
I guess it depends on where you are in the country. I mean, nobody can make a living wage in LA anymore, right?
True. Yeah.
But there was a point where I guess it depends. A lot of my friends that do that kind of work travel around to wherever the hot spots are now, kind of like traveling nurses, I guess, which is not optimal if you're trying to raise a family, obviously. But at any rate, when you say outsourced, what do you mean?
It was, I don't know the name of the company, but he said that they moved out of country, or at least they relied on, a workforce in a different country. And I'm going to venture to say it was basically exploitation of cheap labor abroad, something that many Americans throughout the years, especially in like the Rust Belt, have experienced. So, it's funny because my father kind of tried to hide the fact that he's a Trump supporter. And then we found an envelope where he wrote a note to himself about the monetary donation he gave to Trump. And I talked to him about it, and I was like, Dad, you don't have to hide this from me. I'm not going to be upset with you. It's your right. And so I think Trump's statements about tariffs and bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States is like what really spoke to him about Trump as a candidate.
Do you think that outsourcing is intrinsically exploitative? Because I don't know that I would agree with that. Because and I'm I want to keep as much manufacturing in the country as possible, obviously, because it's it is what it is there. But it does kind of feel like, so me as an individual, let's take it from the lowest possible level. Me as an individual, the more money I make, the more responsibility I feel to pay people to do things that I would normally do to save myself money. You know what I mean? And, if we're doing well as a country, it certainly doesn't hurt us to make sure that our neighbors are taken care of to some degree. Now, Mexico's economy is quite a bit different than ours, and money goes quite a bit farther there, further there. I don't know that I would consider that exploitative, but it's certainly not great for us typically, right? We should try to find people in our own economy to do that with first.
Yeah, our priority should be our own country. I'm firmly in that camp.
Mm.
And when I say that it's the exploitation of labor, it's mostly due to the fact that you have, corporations that are based here in the United States enjoying the opportunities that have been provided to them in this great country. And in order to maximize profits, they go to various countries around the world where labor is incredibly cheap. There are no protections when it comes to, the workplace conditions. When I think about a prime example, it would be Apple relying on Foxconn, which is a factory, in China, in order to make the iPhones that we, for the most part, use. And for a while, they had like nets surrounding the building because so many people were taking their own lives because of how terrible their lives were, how
Yeah, didn't they put
working
nets up
were.
on like
Yeah,
this?
the nets.
Like, what the fuck is that, dude?
Yeah, and I just,
I mean,
and,
I'm laughing
the,
because it's so fucked up.
it is.
Jesus
It
Christ.
totally is. It totally is. And so I feel like it's a lose-lose situation for everyone involved, with the exception of the corporations who get to maximize their profits by, exploiting the cheap labor abroad. And by the way, I mean, it's one thing when you rely on foreign countries to manufacture and produce certain consumer items that are meant for pleasure or enjoyment, but it's an entirely different thing when we're talking about issues pertaining to national security, issues pertaining to pharmaceutical drugs that Americans rely on in order to remain alive. I mean, during COVID, I think the supply chain disruptions made it pretty clear that we're taking a huge risk in relying on, foreign manufacturers for the pharmaceutical drugs that our people need to survive. And so I think that some of the messaging from Donald Trump has been appealing to Americans because they've experienced firsthand what the downsides are of the globalized, economy that we really started to ramp up during the Clinton years.
This is something that is true from the micro level to the macro level. Anytime you stop doing something, stop taking responsibility or stop manufacturing, whatever it is, anytime you eschew some responsibility and pass it off to somebody else, you give them some measure of control over you, right? That's just a fact. Whether it's you're putting your trust in them to make sure that things are done well, that the product itself is manufactured competently and safely or whatever. Then you introduce a foreign element into it, particularly one that's an adversarial foreign element. That seems kind of stupid, frankly, right? Like, probably of all the dumb woke shit that turned everybody off with the left the last 4 years, I think sacrificing some measure of energy independence is probably the dumbest thing they did, to be honest. I think had they not made that mistake, we might be talking about a different result in this election, to be honest, because it affects everything downstream.
On that.
Just not issuing permits for refineries to be able to make more American oil. Like there's some misnomers about it. We didn't shut down pipelines. That's not true. That's just that's just something you see on Facebook to trick old people. But we stopped issuing permits for refineries and stuff like that. Ended up having to buy a little bit more foreign energy than we would want to. We also, I would say, in addition to that rudimentary stuff, the arbitrary dates put on going to so-called clean energy put just an unnecessary restraint on our energy independence. And I think it was a big mistake. Everything is downstream of energy, right? Like shipping costs, production costs, all this stuff. And sure, we're printing too much money. Shouldn't be doing that. But the energy costs just cascade over everything else we do. And I think that probably had a bigger negative impact on the economy than anything else they did.
Yeah, so let me jump in on that because I think this topic is so fascinating. And I think there's a lot of unfortunate myths out there about our so-called energy independence or lack thereof. So the United States remains the top energy producer along with the top energy exporter. And so we are producing more oil and natural gas than any other country on the global market. And we happen to be exporting those fossil fuels at a far higher rate than any other oil producing country on the globe. And so what's happening is, we're talking about major corporations who own, the refineries, who own the fossil fuels that they're, reaping from our land. And they get to make decisions about who they sell it to on the global market. And of course, they're going to sell it to the highest bidder.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue is, unfortunately, our oil refineries need some serious updating because the oil that we're producing, we are unable to refine with the refineries we have here domestically. And so that's part of the reason why we're importing oil from Canada, because our refineries are able to refine that oil as opposed to the oil that we're drilling here in the United States. So I totally agree with the point that you're making in regard to energy prices and how that has a downstream effect on the price of everything else. But I also think that there's just a lack of information out there on news shows about how this global market really works as it pertains to fossil fuels. The other thing is, I'm honestly really terrified that we are barreling toward a hot war with Iran. Iran is one of the major oil producing countries on the globe. And if that source of fossil fuels is done away with as a result of a war, well, consider the fact that China, which relies on Iran for its oil, is then going to look for other sources on the global market, thus competing with the United States and every other country that needs these fossil fuels in order to, run their economy and run their energy.
And what happens when supply is flat and demand goes up? Remind me.
Well, prices go up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that Donald Trump, the incoming president, certainly has his hands full. Biden just allowed Ukraine to use U.S.-made long-range missiles into Russian territory, thus escalating this war. And I think it's a terrible, terrible idea. We're not in a good situation. And, obviously, the price of oil will be impacted based on the global conflicts that are ratcheting up.
Yeah, it's not smart. I mean, certainly not. And this isn't the first time we've that our myopic foreign policy has fucked us with Iran, right? I mean, it happened in the 1950s. They wanted to renegotiate their deal with OPEC and get more of their own money, which seems like a reasonable position to take, frankly. And we helped depose their king. So we could let a theocratic leader in and, so on and so forth. We did that. And then we funded Saddam Hussein to fight them. Right. And then we created ISIS to fight Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. We keep causing all sorts of problems that later blow up in our faces. And so I have a lot of sympathy for individuals who are, in my opinion, wrongly labeled as isolationists. I think these are individuals who believe in national security, but they also believe that the U.S. isn't really helping any situation once we intervene and decide to install our own puppet government. Yeah, it's so stupid. We didn't do that, by the way, with Saudi Arabia. We just, what we did with Saudi Arabia, even after 9/11, we kind of just left it. We made deals with them, actually. There's an old quote from Abraham Lincoln: "If I've made my enemy my friend, have I not defeated him?" Right? And I'll tell you what doesn't happen. Rich countries don't do terrorism. They don't. Bahrain doesn't do terrorism. Qatar doesn't do terrorism. Kuwait doesn't do terrorism. Jordan doesn't do terrorism. Poor countries run by psychopaths do. And I feel some degree of sympathy for MBS even, because he's kicking and screaming, trying to drag that country into modernity right now. You can see the sign, even dealing with the Abraham Accords, intercepting rockets going towards Israel, shit like that. I know that family has, let's call it a complicated history with funding terrorism and stuff. But if you see and this is something that's true, I think, in political discourse as well. If you see somebody trying to make a move in the right direction, the smart thing to do is to grab them and help them, right? And not we can't ever work with those people again. Fuck them. That seems like a mistake to me. It seems like a much better idea to reach into Iran in some way and help private corporations do better. You know what I mean? That would make a lot more sense to me than trying to pit even than trying to pit people against each other. Because if you're seen to do that, people get defensive. Just try to help them make money. I know that Trump likes to sit on this. Iran was weak and poor when I got out, and that fair enough, right? I mean, that's certainly one way to do it. But sanctions almost always have the same result. Like in our in our pipe dream minds, we think, oh, the common people are going to rise up and overthrow their government if we sanction them enough. It's like, no, dude, they hate you for doing that.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the economic sanctions only hurt the civilians. And so the individuals in positions of power will find a way to ensure that their bread is buttered and that they're okay. But it's really the people who suffer. Now, there's been discontent among Iranian civilians toward, the Islamic fundamentalist government that they're dealing with, especially when it comes. Yeah. And so, the Ayatollah and all of that, like there have been protests, especially when it comes to the brutality that they have carried out against their own people. But I want to make sure that we're clear about why the United States has any issue with Iran at all. And at the heart of that is Israel. Israel has been egging the United States on to go to war with Iran on behalf of Israel for years now. And, say what you will about Obama. I'm sure you have your critiques, and I do as well. But one of the accomplishments of the Obama administration, along with our Western allies, was the Iran nuclear deal, which ensured that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons. There were safeguards in place. Foreign countries that were part of this deal were able to go to Iran and make sure that they're not developing nuclear weapons. And I think it was a big mistake for Donald Trump to rip up the Iran nuclear deal. And I have no doubt that he did that on behalf of Israel. I'm tired of the American government at this point feeling like more of a puppet for the Israeli government. I want us to actually do what's best for the American people, and going to war with Iran would not make sense to me. But that is what we're inching closer and closer to. And I'm going to be clear, the Biden administration putting out, in my opinion, BS about how Iran is planning assassination attempts against Trump without providing a shred of evidence, in my opinion, is the Democrats' way of egging Donald Trump on in order to continue barreling this country toward war with Iran. And I hope that doesn't happen.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a couple of things there. One, I think that we need a constitutional amendment that prevents anybody from holding dual citizenship while they're in elected office in this country.
Yep.
That's fucking crazy to me, that you can be a citizen of another country and serve in office here. Like that
Agreed.
should be, you should have to renounce any foreign citizenship permanently. Now, I was told in February and then again in June and then again in October that Iran is 2 to 3 weeks away from having a nuke. How does that work exactly? I'm pretty familiar with the passage of time, as Kamala likes to say. I'm pretty familiar with how calendars work and time and shit like that. Not too familiar with how something can be indefinitely 2 to 3 weeks away. Do you know anything about that?
I know that there's been a lot of propaganda in order to scare Americans and essentially manufacture consent for a war with Iran. It's very reminiscent of the lead up to the preemptive war that the United States carried out in Iraq. And that was a complete and utter disaster. And look, I'm just going to say this. I find it so utterly disgusting how administration after administration, the State Department makes abundantly clear how little they care about the lives of the men and women in our armed forces. They're nothing more than pawns and tools for these disgusting wars that should not be fought to begin with. And the lack of respect for human lives, including American lives, really bothers me. And so when Trump talks about how he's the peace candidate, look, he took some actions that could have led to a hot war, especially with Iran. And luckily that didn't happen. But my point is that message of not starting new wars was appealing to so many Americans because people are fatigued, exhausted, and absolutely sick of carrying out these conflicts or intervening in international conflicts to the detriment of the American people, to the detriment of our, country's finances. We're just sick of it. And so he understood the messaging that would appeal to people. The question is, will he stay true to that messaging and not allow himself to get egged into a war with Iran or some other country?
Sure.
But honestly, I am worried because he's close with Netanyahu. They've had several conversations since he got elected, and Netanyahu really wants us to go to war with Iran. And if you go back and listen to some of the speeches that Netanyahu gave to our Congress before we did that preemptive war in Iraq, you'll see some similarities. So I don't know what's going to happen. It's anyone's guess, but I hope that Trump really does hold the line and refuse to engage in any type of hot war.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, Netanyahu belongs in prison. You know, I've seen enough evidence now to believe that the whole Epstein thing was a Mossad operation. I believe that to my core. They use children to try to blackmail fucking American politicians to get their way, and that's about as evil as it gets. But beyond all that, the stuff that isn't speculative that we know for sure is that, you know, a couple of weeks before October 7th, he was trying to essentially overthrow the Supreme Court of Israel, right? That this guy, and he was going to get ousted for it. And I'm not saying the two are connected. I have no idea about that. Hamas is crazy. They're going to do crazy shit, but certainly he belongs in prison. Now to the other part, nobody wants war less than people that have been there. I think that's probably true. So it does give me some hope that he's putting actual combat people in these positions instead of, limp wrist people like Anthony Blinken. He's never been in a fight in his life. He may have gotten into an argument in a parking lot before, but he probably got in his car and drove away from it because he's a coward.
You're being too generous to him.
No, I mean, like, he probably didn't roll the window down. You know what I mean? He's just a giant piece of shit. And, you know, a lot of people don't know this. The Afghanistan withdrawal, for example, the DOD was not in charge of that operation. That was a State Department operation. Why would a 20-year-long war be put into the hands of the State Department for evacuation? Why would you abandon Bagram Air Base and blah, blah, blah? It's like, I think this might be the most incompetent group of cabinet secretaries for one administration I've ever seen in my life. Between Mayorkas and Blinken, just those two guys alone, this has been an unmitigated disaster. They haven't really gotten much right. I actually think that trading for Griner was not that bad. I don't think that was that big of a deal. People like, oh, he's a warlord, criminal, whatever the fuck. It's like, so are half the people you're fucking talking to right now. You know what I mean? Just relax. At any rate, I don't think Israel needs our help. I don't know why they're trying. It's just like, it's somebody who knows they're capable of defending themselves, just trying to get somebody else to do the work for them, frankly. Like they don't
100%.
They don't need 100%. Our help. How much help did we give them during the 6 Days War? And this is 40 fucking years ago. Egypt and several other forces massed against them, and it took them 6 days to beat their ass. It's like, really? This is the poor victim that needs everybody's help? I don't think so, man. I just don't believe that.
Well, they had a budget surplus in 2021. Mind you, that was right in the middle of the pandemic as the U.S. debt was exploding. And why exactly are we giving them tens of billions of dollars of additional military aid when we have our own people to take care of? I mean, we've been giving them consistently like close to $4 billion a year in military aid, no questions asked. And the additional money that I'm talking about here, like I believe it was like $26 billion, is on top of the money that we'd already been giving Israel. I mean, how do you justify giving a country that had a budget surplus in 2021 more military aid? We here in the United States have not had a budget surplus since 2001. And so I think you make a really good point. It doesn't make any sense. And the only reason why there is unwavering support and military aid to Israel, regardless of whether there's a Democrat in charge or a Republican in charge, is because both parties have been captured by the Israel lobby. There's no question about it. And so, you know, you have someone like Donald Trump who just got funded to the tune of $100 million by Miriam Adelson. Her only concern and her only goal is to help Israel. And she made that clear. And she told Trump, like, this is the money. I need you to allow Israel to annex the West Bank. And they've already begun doing that. And so do I think Trump is going to intervene and prevent that from happening? I don't. Do I think he's going to hold Netanyahu accountable for any of the war crimes he's committed or the way that he has treated his own people in trying to dismantle, their system of checks and balances? I don't. But if he were to surprise me and actually do the right thing, I have no shame. I would come on air and I would say that I'm a Trump supporter because it would take balls to do that. No U.S. president has had the balls to stand up to Israel. Every single one of them has been dog walked by the Israeli government. And I think it's humiliating for the American people. And I would love to see an actual strong leader confront Netanyahu and say, no, you don't get everything you want. Sorry.
How much do you think it is allegiance or capture by Israel versus just funding the military-industrial complex? I mean, I'm sure
I think it's both.
Yeah, it's got to be
definitely both.
The Ukraine thing proves it's both, but I mean, it does seem to. We say no to Ukraine sometimes. It's rare that we say no to Israel.
True. Yep.
We should say no to everybody, though. If you're not an American, you don't get any money from America. That seems pretty standard to me. Or if you do, you should have to pay it back, or you should have to earn it in some way. I don't know exactly what anybody. Certainly Ukraine. I've had this is. I was talking to somebody on the phone this morning about this actually. The people that we have in the State Department and CIA right now that are decision makers were trained by people who were trained by Cold War people, right? So they have secondhand knowledge of a massive failure. The Cold War was not an intelligence win. It was an economic win. Economic warfare won that. Rollback by Reagan. We just outspent them. We should have done that in the 1960s. We could have done. We started it with the space program, and we just cut it off in '74 for no reason. If we had kept going, we would have never have that. Like the Cold War would have ended in the '70s at some point because they were going broke already. The same thing is going on right now with China, and I wonder if they're gonna, since finally it's come full circle again, and we're in the same kind of position we were in before, where you're up against a developing but struggling economy in China, right? They are struggling mightily right now, and we have an opportunity to put them down at number 2 again, like they should be, frankly, until they improve some of their human rights stuff. And are we going to take that opportunity, or are we going to continue to make the same stupid mistakes? And the question really, that's the long form of it, but the question really is, do we want to win or do we want to bleed them, right? The same way we did with Russia, the same way we've done with the Middle East. Do we want to bleed them for more money, or do we just want to win decisively? And I think it's probably bleed them, because that's how you make more money, right?
Well, I just want to go back to your point about how China is a developing but struggling economy. I mean, the reason why all of a sudden you see the emergence of a multipolar globe is because of the fact that the United States opened up, trade with China that allowed for China to grow its economy and become the kind of power that it is now. And so when we think about the right policy prescriptions or decisions, I really think that we have to consider the fact that what might be in the best interests of multinational corporations or U.S.-based corporations could very well conflict with what's in the best interests of our country, our national security, and of the U.S. workforce. And so just something to think about moving forward. But in regard to, U.S. policy toward China, I struggle to really give you a lot of detailed answers because it's not something I feel I have enough expertise in to comment on. But I do see that China has taken a very different approach in terms of building allyships on the international stage, where you see the United States kind of using, bullying tactics, sanctions, things like that. You have China essentially going into foreign countries and building things for them, right? Building infrastructure on behalf of the people in those countries. And that's a way of using diplomacy in order to strengthen the relationships that China has abroad. I'm worried that, when you take everything into consideration, when you take the way the United States appears on the international stage as we are aiding and abetting Israel in what it's doing in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, as it continues broadening this war in the Middle East and fighting this multi-front war that sooner or later, if this keeps going, they're going to expect the United States to fight alongside Israeli troops. Like that, I don't think that's going to put the U.S. in a great position. I don't think that we're building important allies through diplomatic means. I think we're doing quite the opposite, whereas China is building stronger alliances abroad through diplomatic means. So just something to consider.
Yeah, especially in Central Africa. But it's also one of the reasons that China's economy is weak right now. If you think about it from a business perspective, they're a company that has gone public and spent quite a bit of money in the first couple of quarters of going public on infrastructure, which looks like you're in the red and it looks bad for your stock price, right? And it can be unless things work the way you wanted them to, right? So if there's a return on your investment 3 years down the road, you'll look good again. You'll be in the green for multiple quarters in a row. We've gone through all this before. But there's an opportunity to interdict that, right? Now, I don't necessarily think that harming China's economy is a good idea for the United States, anyways. Like we shouldn't be in the business of degrading other people's countries. I don't think that's a smart move to make. It certainly doesn't make a lot of sense to look at the second strongest person and try to turn them into an enemy, right? But whether they've been hostile or not, it doesn't make any sense to do that. The smarter move is to do what they're doing better, right? So there's really no reason. We're still talking about fossil fuels and shit, but certainly we need that stuff, and we're going to for 50 years. But we need to be talking about lithium and cobalt. We need to be talking about Peru and Chile that combined hold about 20% of the world's lithium and cobalt. Why have we not invested heavily in extraction there, and then refinery as you go farther north, and then assembly in the United States, and create a manufacturing chain to secure, as you mentioned before, independence when it comes to these devices that we so desperately need these days. No, not one. I haven't heard one person in government having this conversation about setting up that pipeline, which, by the way, would also make Central or South and Central American countries rich, so their people will stop fleeing here. It just doesn't make. It seems like there's a bunch of retarded children running our government, to be honest. Like they've got some idea, they have some idea of what it should look like back in the day, but they have no balls and no experience in the real world. That's what it seems like.
For me, it seems like government is no longer run by individuals who have the best interests of the country at heart. It feels like everyone is in it for themselves, a way to enrich themselves. One of my biggest issues with Congress right now is the fact that not only are they totally bribed through through legal bribes, of course, it's legal through Supreme Court decisions, but nonetheless, unlimited money goes into these super PACs associated with these candidates, and this is a way of ensuring that once the candidates are elected or reelected, they'll carry out the best interests of the donors as opposed to the voters. But on top of that, we're talking about people who are trading individual stocks with insider information that they get from closed door briefings. How is that acceptable?
I have no idea.
It's insane. So they're not looking out for us. And it doesn't matter. This is a bipartisan effort. I want to be clear about that. Democrat, Republican, does not matter. Okay. There are serious examples here of members of both parties, outperforming the S&P 500. Like, you're going to tell me that Nancy Pelosi is like some sort of stock trading genius, that she's going to outperform the S&P 500 year after year? Like, give me a break.
Well, it's going to be difficult to make that claim moving forward after she chose Kamala Harris, right? Like if you're yeah, it is. Like if you're like, apparently the word on the street is she's deeply regretful, and the reason that she's going to do another 2 years in Congress or run again in 26 is because she wants to spend some time repairing her image after having made this huge blunder.
It's all about them.
Yeah.
It's all about them. It's all about their legacy, their image, their money. That's all it is. And I'm sick of it. I really am. I think the Democratic leadership needs to be wiped out completely and replaced with look, it sucks because even if you replace Democratic leadership, the same systemic issues remain, right? Like the incentives to be a corrupt goon remain. And I think that's where the problem is, right? Unless you have a system that ensures that public servants act as public servants, they're just going to continue getting corrupted by the same things.
Yeah. So you have to make a couple of moves all at the same time. Certainly there has to be turnover in electoral politics. There has to be money removed from it, and then bureaucrats all have to go, right, in the same fail swoop. And to be honest, that's going to require a dictator. I don't think you can get that done through any kind of democratic means. I honestly, how the fuck would that even work? Certainly Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy can advise people to fire a bunch of people, and sure, that'll slow it down for a couple of years maybe. But then as soon as statists get back into power, they're just going to plus that number up, rehire the same fucking people probably, right? And it's just going to go over again. I agree. It seems like almost an insurmountable issue. And to be honest, it's one of my issues with progressivism as an idea, as a concept, because it requires state power to enforce it, right? And I just think, here's a good, this is the example I always give to people on both sides of the gun issue. It's like everybody including yourself, knows at least one person that should not have a gun, right? I think we all know some wild asshole that shouldn't be anywhere near guns. And who are we going to leave to adjudicate that? Is it the state? Because the state obviously will weaponize things. Any power you give the state will eventually be weaponized. So I think there has to be a better answer than that. Because anytime you give them power, they're never going to surrender it, right? Like this Citizens United bullshit is the worst, probably the worst thing that's ever happened to this country. I think it's probably the worst thing that's ever happened to this country. We may never recover from it. I don't know, honestly. You're asking people to get into office and vote immediately to downgrade their own power, and that is a big ask.
That's very true. Yeah. I mean, the idea of relying on Congress to do the right thing, I mean, to basically police themselves and pass legislation that would prevent the type of corruption that they've been enjoying for decades now. It's just not going to happen. I know you've had Cenk Uygur on your show, and he would like a constitutional convention in order to add an amendment to our constitution, ensuring that elections are publicly funded. And you can do that with the support of, you don't even need all of the states to agree to this. You just need a certain number of the states, I believe 2/3.
37.
But I think the issue is, I think that it might be the only way to do what we need to do. But there's also the added issue of a constitutional convention leading to amendments that we didn't see coming and didn't want. But I mean, that's how the process is supposed to work. So it's, in my opinion, better to take that risk and try to fix what's like just inherently broken in our government at the moment, rather than continue going along with the broken system, which is ripping this country apart in so many ways. And look, I got to be honest about something that I'm sure I'll get a lot of backlash for, but there is a silver lining for Democrats, okay, when it comes to Kamala Harris's loss. She outraised Donald Trump. She raised $1 billion and squandered it in 3 months. I don't even know how she did it, but my point is she lost. The money didn't help, okay? The money didn't save her. And I hope that communicates a message to the Democratic Party. Hey, if you're going to carry out the best interests of your donors and put out a dog shit campaign where you're not actually addressing the concerns of your base and the voters, you're going to lose. So choose wisely. Yeah,
I mean, so I don't know what the final fundraising numbers were between Obama and McCain in 2008, but I know that it wasn't the money that did it. Obviously, there was a groundswell of support for Obama, just generally speaking, but the way that they used Facebook marketing was the best digital ground game, the first real digital ground game ever, but definitely the best we've seen until Trump in 2016. That was pretty good as well. There's certainly ways to do it without the money. So hopefully, I don't know. I don't hear a lot of fucking Democrats learning any lessons right now. It's mostly still pointing fingers, but we'll see. It's still early. There's 5 stages of grief here, so let's let them work through all of them first before we start making judgments.
Fair.
So I think we would agree that the government sucks. Where does that leave you politically, if you had to identify yourself? Because people on the left tend to rely more on government institutions to get things done, but there is a far enough left part that's more populist. So I wonder what would you even consider yourself at this point?
I'm totally unaligned. I don't really belong in either party at the moment. And I definitely hold populist economic views. I've definitely moderated considerably on some of these social issues, including crime, immigration. I mean, people think that I'm like a transphobe or something. I'm not at all. I've moderated a tiny bit on the transgender issue pertaining to, children being medicalized. I want better safeguards. And I also think that women's rights matter. And so I don't appreciate the fact that women haven't been consulted at all when it comes to issues like including transgender women in sports or allowing them to, undress in women's locker rooms. I just think like women have been completely left out of that conversation, and it's pretty unfair because their rights matter just as much as the rights of transgender individuals. So those are the issues that make people think that I'm like a right winger, but I don't really think I fit in with the right wing either. I think that I have grown a modicum of respect for the right wing when it comes to some of these social issues, because a lot of the things they were talking about were ignored, but they were making some okay points, some decent points that should have been addressed. But economically speaking, I would say that I'm firmly in a populist category.
Yeah, I think, one, being independent is useful. It's that the issue is that it's easy to fall into nihilism. It's easy to be that person that's like just lobbing bombs all the time. Like, I don't believe in anything. Like you start with, I don't support either side. I take things as they come. And if you lean into being critical of both parties constantly, then you end up being an asshole, frankly, right? Just a useless nihilist. And I think it's really important for people to spend as much time, if not more, finding things they agree with than things they disagree with, right? I think the things that we disagree with are obvious. The things that we agree with can be less obvious because of just the noise. And not just for the political process, but also for yourself. I mean, it makes you a miserable piece of shit if you're just sitting around whining about everything all the time. God damn it, I can't take that anymore. Anybody that's like that like pretty much every conservative influencer or whatever the fuck they call themselves on the internet these days is like, good God, man. Even now, after having, I guess you could say, won this latest battle, they're like, it's going to be the next. They're like addicted to being contrarians at this point. Everything's something has to be negative. I have to have something to complain about, otherwise I have no identity now. And that seems like just absolute poison. Not just for the process, which it is, but also for yourself as an individual. Why would you want to live like that?
Definitely. I mean, for those who are critical of both parties, that can definitely happen. If you're a hyper partisan, everything sucks when your party isn't in charge, but everything is great when your party is in charge. I mean, I think we experienced quite a bit of that with apologists for the Democratic Party over the last 4 years. Certainly, the fine people over at MSNBC would like have you believe that Biden was the greatest president of all time. It's just an absolute joke.
Oh, I'm sure you heard Joy Reid say that Harris's campaign was flawless. She ran a flawless campaign. I'm like,
I mean, Queen Latifah endorsed.
She never endorses.
That was so insane.
Oh my God.
So yeah, like those people, I don't find to be helpful to the conversation at all. But the way that I approach politics now, as opposed to how I was earlier, is I take the issues as they come and I judge the president or the party in charge based on how they deal with that issue. And so everyone's freaking out already about, President-elect Trump and who his cabinet appointments are. Sure, you can speculate about how these individuals would perform in the role should they get confirmed, but I don't want to be in 24-hour panic mode as I feel that I was in his first term. I kind of want to take everything as it comes. I think that there were certain things that he did in his first administration that we missed and didn't give him credit for because we were in panic mode constantly. And so I'm going to handle this differently the second time around and kind of look at what he's doing with a more sober perspective that isn't influenced by hyper partisans in the media.
I think it's, I was talking to my buddy on his show about this the other day, but I think it's important to not make, what's a good way to say this? To not make personal judgments about somebody necessarily, right? Because I don't know that it helps to, like, there's a lot of people in let's just, this is a concrete example. There's people on the political right. If Cenk were to be nominated to be in charge of getting money out of politics, they're like, oh, he believes this and this, and I hate that guy. Fuck him. You said this one time. It's like, okay, fair enough. You don't like him as a person, but if you put him in that role, do you think he would work hard to achieve that goal? I think the answer is yes, right? So I don't really give a shit about my personal feelings about this man. You align people's motives with the job. That's your job as a leader, and as a voter, you are a leader to some degree, right? Because you're selecting people for positions. You have to be able to dispassionately decide, okay, so the Department of Defense is running people out in uniform where there's men dressed like women, or vice versa. I'm like, no, we're not doing that. This is a warfighting organization. Our job is to kill the enemy. We're not fucking playing your games anymore, right? Okay, so Pete is kind of a dick sometimes. He doesn't have bureaucratic institutional experience. Okay, cool. But will he root out wokeness? Yeah, I think he will. Now, the problem is, even at that point, this is your job as a commentator or a voter or whatever your position is. You should be paying way more attention to your side than the other side to make sure that they're actually, one, actually doing what they're saying they're going to do, and two, not overstepping that boundary at some point. I think there's something in the Bible about that. I don't remember exactly what it says, but it's something about a plank in your eye and something else. But, this seems like it seems reasonable to me to forget about your personal opinions on somebody's history or character or whatever, and try to think about what motivates them, what their beliefs are, and how the beliefs motivate them. And if I take that combination and put them in this particular job, will it be successful? And I think you can find people on either side of the aisle you disagree with that would be particularly good at a certain thing, right? And that doing the right thing should be a nonpartisan issue, in my opinion, right? Taking care of people is a nonpartisan issue. I think that I'm not conservative. I don't believe in any of that shit. I guess the closest thing you could say is libertarian, I guess, but they do some wild shit. But I think it is unethical, at minimum, to say in the richest country in the history of the world that you can be as healthy as you can afford to be. I think that is evil, actually, is what I believe.
Hell yeah, I agree.
I don't think putting the government in charge of like rationing healthcare to people is a great idea either. There's got to be a way to deal with this shit. But it certainly isn't by just saying, well, fuck Obamacare or fuck this or that. It's like you would never look your neighbor in the face and say that. And if you did, you're a cunt, frankly, right? Like you shouldn't be speaking in public if you feel that way. So there's not a right or a left position on that, in my opinion.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I think this new era of American politics really makes clear, at least to me, that these party labels don't really make any sense. Like they don't apply because, I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm old enough to remember when Michelle Obama, as first lady in Obama's first term, was just dealing with like a wave of hatred because she was trying to do like this "Let's Get Healthy" campaign for kids. So she planted a vegetable garden at the White House and was like trying to do exercises with the kids, on the White House lawn. And for whatever reason, at that time, conservatives were freaking out about it, and they saw it as like the nanny state. And of course, the left was defending Michelle Obama. I was one of them. But now with RFK Jr. as someone who Donald Trump has tapped as head of Health and Human Services, the left is freaking out over some of the things he has said in regard to our food supply and everything. They think he's kooky. Look, I think that there are certain things that he has said that I do not agree with, okay, particularly when it comes to his claims about the downsides of vaccines, which have not been borne out in the research yet. I mean, it could be true, but it has not been proven in any studies or any research. However, I think he's totally right about things he has said about the damage we're causing to the environment, the toxicity of our food supply, the corruption within government agencies like the FDA. I mean, there's a reason why every other week we hear about a food recall because there's a listeria outbreak or an E. coli outbreak. So everyone on the left who's freaking out about RFK Jr. as if he's like, public enemy number one, I'm very curious, how do you reconcile the fact that he's saying a lot of the things that the left had been saying? all of a sudden, because he's going to be part of Trump's administration, we're going to pretend like everything he stands for is wrong and we're against it. And that's really the issue I have. You know, you talk about the nihilism of individuals who criticize both political parties, and I totally hear you on that. And I've seen that and witnessed it myself. But I think it's also equally damaging, if not more damaging, when you have hyper partisans controlling our media and controlling, you know, the narratives that Americans are consuming. And by the way, I say that as someone who was wrongly, in my opinion, a hyper partisan. That blinded me to a lot of crap. And so I'm trying to personally do better. And I'm able to see clearly, like, just how damaging hyper partisanship really is. Because what ends up happening is one side will take a position, and even if they're correct on that position, their opponents automatically, by default, take the opposite position. How is that helpful?
It's stupid.
Like, let's actually listen to each other, hear each other out, because I actually think both parties make good points, both parties make bad points. But how can we work together and compromise to actually carry out policies that benefit people?
Yeah, here's the takeaway from that. Being a centrist, being in the middle doesn't mean that you're somewhere between the left and the right. It means that sometimes the left is correct and sometimes the right is correct. It doesn't mean that you take a middle position on every single thing. That's fucking stupid, right? Like that. Yep. That's Neville Chamberlain. We don't want to live our lives like that, being cowards. That's Pope Pius. And yeah, on the RFK thing, you know, this is just it's such a weird coalition that Trump has put together now. It really does seem like people who are representing reasonable positions, regardless of politics. Now, the people that are representing those positions, as is always the case, are egomaniacs and fucking people that are probably a little bit too far into it than they should be. But they're representing a very attractive position because people can sniff out bullshit pretty easily. You know, being told that Biden's sharpest attack, they're like, I'm sorry, what? This guy's like falling down off bicycles and shit. Well, it's like we all like the guy. He seems like a nice guy and everything, but can we not pretend that that's the case? You know, people could sniff that out. And I think it's why so many feel politically homeless these days. You know, I think what I've seen over the past 15 years or so is the most common political transition is from one populist group to another, from progressive to libertarian or vice versa. The two groups that are closest in America, in my opinion, right now, are the libertarian and progressive side, and then the state side, right? The Republicans and Democrats that want war and all this other bullshit. I don't think it's right now. The right-wing media is trying to say the Republicans are the party of anti-war and blah, 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 and all this stuff. It's like, no, I think most people don't want war. I think that you're just trying to distinguish yourself in branding, which makes sense from a marketing standpoint, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the good of the country. You know, if right now is the best possible time for Republican leadership, and I don't give a fuck about Republicans. I think it's the best time ever for them to just be reasonable and accept anybody who comes along, right? Like, you guys agree that we should be protecting women? Good, let's do that. You guys agree we shouldn't be getting into stupid fucking wars? Let's do that too. Because, you know, there's no Republican and Democrat anymore. It just doesn't exist. But we will always have, just like every country will always have this, they'll always have some battle between the population and the state. And usually it defines itself in right versus left somehow, where right is, you know, more on the typically on the dad side, and left is more on the mom side. And it makes sense. Biologically speaking, it should be like that, frankly. The problem is defining them, right? And I think we leave the effort of defining the role of government and the party definitions to the government and the media instead of just doing it ourselves. You know what I mean? Like, you and I can have a conversation and talk about all the things we agree on, and then talk about the things we disagree on. And that would define our respective roles in society much more than just like, oh, the Republic, like you said, and I've been saying this for years. My God, the more that you want to believe something, the more skeptical of it you should be, right? And then if you are a hyper partisan, you get put in a position where you have to defend shit and people that you don't agree with. That's fucking stupid. Why would you do that?
I mean, I've been amusing myself just like watching hyper partisans on the left, especially over the last like 2, 3 years, defend the indefensible, defend things that I know for a fact they would not be defending if, a Republican administration were carrying it out. And so, you know, my so-called unaligned status is something that I came out with this year. And the one thing I can say is, even with people who are angry at me, they feel it's wrong that I'm like what grifting. Identifying as unaligned is like the most non-grifty thing you can do, because you're not part of a tribe and you're not a cheerleader for a tribe. And so like those avenues of making money are like totally shut off to you. But it's very liberating. I feel the most liberated, ideologically speaking, than I've ever felt in my entire career. And I love it because certain things that make hyperpartisans freak out, I don't freak out about, because I'm able to look at whatever the issue is with a more sober mind and make a decision about whether or not it's even worth freaking out about. Sometimes, yes, it is. And other times it's not. And so I don't think it's healthy for the country to constantly be in a state of panic, depending on who's in the White House and, whether or not, your tribe is being represented in the administration. I think at the end of the day, what matters the most is whether or not policies are benefiting American people, making their lives better, or if it's making their lives worse. And so I'm going to keep an open mind moving forward and just see what happens.
Yeah, and I would challenge right-leaning folks to do that as well, just because your team is empowered. I mean, look, Trump bungled the COVID stuff about as much as you can, from my perspective. I mean, letting Anthony Fauci stay in charge is the dumbest shit he's ever done in his life, probably. Well, that's not true. He's done some dumb shit, but that one in particular, like giving somebody with an axe to grind, who's like I guess historically has misrepresented the facts on medicine quite a bit. Everybody seems to forget that Fauci in the early 80s was the guy out on the stump on news shows telling everybody that if you got breathed on by somebody with AIDS, you were going to die the next week. You know what I mean? Like he created
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he created a lot of the moral panic around HIV.
I did not know that.
Just a
That's
giant
really
piece of shit as a human being. He's completely useless. And letting somebody, and look, that's one of the criticisms of Trump in his first administration, that his defenders will say he was naive about the deep state, as they call it. And fair enough, I guess. But man, it took you 4 years to realize it. That seems like a long learning curve, right? I mean, you certainly should not have. And he's never really apologized for the vaccine stuff, which I think he should have. Giving people experimental vaccines is crazy. It's like we've never done that in the history of this country before. If you look at how long it took to develop polio vaccine and MMR and stuff like that, it took years. And MMR still gets sued from time to time for vaccine injury.
I mean, the technology for that vaccine didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They had already developed it in Canada years ago, and then basically had to specialize it specifically for COVID. If anything, look, I'm vaccinated. Whatever you feel about vaccines, like that's up to you. I was actually really irritated with all of the misleading information about the vaccine and what it was capable of doing. Because
like
remember,
it stops
in the beginning,
here, the whole it stops here.
If you get the vaccine, if people get vaccinated, they'll be unable to spread it. That was the.
It's a good example of what you were saying before, though, that you just have to full-throatedly defend your side regardless of the truth, right?
Yeah, I mean, COVID was an interesting case study of like how fear can kind of make your mind so hazy that you're either super in favor of something or super against something without really having all the information. And I just, in lieu of any real like solid, credible people to like turn to, all we had was the federal government, right? And so they were learning as they went, and there was a lot of misinformation that they were pushing out there as, the pandemic was developing. Like, so for instance, Anthony Fauci lied in the very beginning of COVID by telling Americans that the masks will not help you. Like, you don't need to mask up. And the reason why he did that is because there was a shortage of masks for healthcare workers. So he lied to us with the intention of, keeping that supply of masks readily available for healthcare workers and ensuring that Americans weren't like using that supply for themselves. Well, when you start off with a lie like that, number one, people obviously lose trust in anything else you have to say once they realize that you've lied. But also, number two, like the inability to just trust Americans and be honest with them is disgusting, right? Just come out and say, hey, the masks are necessary for the healthcare workers who are on the front lines dealing with these, significantly ill patients. We have a shortage, so we need Americans to like avoid buying, these supplies. I think that would have been far better than lying in the beginning of the pandemic, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason the right doesn't want government at the way it is right now, right? You're making a pretty good argument for it because they look at us the way that historical aristocracies have looked at the plebs. Like we're the people we're the ones that know. He referred to himself as the science, for fuck's sake. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of guy shouldn't be anywhere near a policy ever. He should never be setting policy. Anybody that thinks that way, that feels like he's immune from criticism, especially that's asinine that we would let somebody do that, right? Either way, I think it's best to give people more information. We're seeing that now. It's probably the reason that Trump got elected, in my opinion, is that the fourth wall of media was broken. People noticed and I think one of the despite all of the commercials that ran or the gotcha moments or the incompetence of the Harris campaign, all this stuff, certainly there were a lot of contributing factors. But I think that one of the biggest things was people on social media seeing those compilation videos of news person after news person saying the exact same fucking thing over and over. And they're like, oh shit, these people are fucking lying to me. I can see it now. And I think breaking that fourth wall of media was, man, I mean, it's going to make you more popular as an independent journalist for sure.
I mean, maybe, I guess.
It will, certainly.
Yeah.
It has to. I mean, it worked. You've been seeing it leading up to this point with, Rogan and I guess you could say Sagar and Yeti to some degree, like people like that are kind of doing, and you guys as well, doing independent stuff. It's we're in a delicate position.
I got to be honest. Like and when you say independent, do you mean ideologically independent, or do you just mean independent of corporate media?
Corporate.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, and we've been independent of corporate media, since the beginning, and that's part of the reason why we do have like a loyal base of viewers who appreciate the fact that even if we say things that they disagree with, at least they know it's coming from an authentic, sincere place, as opposed to, a script that's been approved by corporate executives who are in touch with, party leaders. I think that's very much what's happening at MSNBC. It is shocking to me that like these people still have jobs after the disgusting lies that they've told. Like, Morning Joe in particular, like I definitely have an axe to grind with them because they lied. They were part of the huge cover up about Biden's mental decline. Even after the debate, they continued with that ridiculous lie. And when Kamala Harris was the Democratic nominee who replaced Biden, they lied about her as well. And in fact, I remember doing a segment about how Joe Scarborough started attacking journalists who were simply doing their jobs in straight news reporting. This isn't commentary. This isn't punditry. They were just doing straight news reporting about Kamala Harris and where she stood on various policies. And what they would do is they would look back at like 2019 when she was running for president in the Democratic primary. And her views or her stances were very different from what she was espousing in this more recent campaign. Joe Scarborough was pissed about that. He thinks that American voters should remain in the dark about what Kamala Harris represents because in his mind, Donald Trump is such a special threat that we need to do everything and anything. Journalists need to hide the ball and do anything and everything to ensure that Harris gets elected over Trump. But it is not the job of journalists to work as political operatives. And increasingly, audiences are expecting that from journalists. And I think that's a real problem. And so that's one of the things I've been pushing back against lately.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because you probably voted Democrat your entire life, I would imagine, right?
Until recently, yeah.
Until recently, yeah. So Just as a, I guess, not that you're a typical just party line person, but what was your, and I guess maybe just being in, you're not in a bubble, right? Like you experience a lot of everything, so you're unique in this regard to some degree. But what was it like for somebody who's historically leaned left to hear the Trump's literal Hitler stuff, and then election happens, he wins, and then it's just like, oh, peaceful transfer, because nobody would ever peacefully transfer power to Adolf Hitler, right? So I'm trying to understand the average Democratic voter and where their head is at right now, because that's got to be really disorienting, frankly, politically.
Well, I never bought into the Hitler claims. I thought it was so utterly short-sighted and also disrespectful to people whose ancestors were victimized by actual Hitler to compare Trump to Hitler. Cenk and I got into a brief but very fiery argument on the show about whether or not Trump is a fascist. I don't show off my credentials. I don't give a crap about them at all. But like, I have an academic understanding of fascism. I got my graduate degree in political science, so I know what fascism is. And I get that the Democratic Party was calling him a fascist specifically to fearmonger about him and solidify, the chances of Harris beating him. But I just think it's so unhelpful and it's so counterproductive because, what if he wins? Then you clowns are gonna, you're not gonna do election denialism. Like, to Democrats' credit, they didn't do that. But I mean, Biden is going to be at his inauguration. Kamala Harris in her concession speech congratulated him. And it's like, how do you justify congratulating a guy you said you believe is a fascist just a few weeks ago? Like, how do you congratulate that guy?
Well, have you heard for, like, I don't know, certainly you've got fans that are just ordinary Democratic voters. I don't know enough people that, like, all the people that I know are they're in a different kind of bubble, which is a bubble where they're exposed to everything, so they have a better understanding of how all this has played out over the last 10 years or so. But just an average person who doesn't give a fuck about politics, who has voted Democrat their whole life, probably because their parents did, frankly, right? Or because their parents voted Republican and they wanted to rebel, whatever it is, right? That we all get started somehow, and you just kind of stay on that road for a while. I really want to understand how the suburban Chicagoite, right? Somebody that lives in the south suburbs of Chicago has voted Democrat their whole life, how they feel about Trump being president. There has to be some level of panic right now, right?
Oh, for sure. And my heart breaks for people who like bought that lie and are genuinely living in fear at the moment because they think that Trump's going to round people up and throw them in internment camps. I'll also say this. There's something particularly narcissistic in thinking that, like, the federal government is going to target you in particular and throw you in an internment camp. Look, I don't think any of that is going to happen. And I hate the fact that, as a campaign strategy, the Democrats decided to instill fear in half of the electorate. And I hope that people have woken up. Like, it's totally fine to be fearful of the types of policies Donald Trump and his administration might implement. But fearful in terms of, like, there's going to be additional tax cuts for corporations, and like that's going to, defund certain social safety net programs that Americans rely on, to make ends meet. Like, that kind of stuff you should be fearful about, right? Because he has made clear that they're looking to cut like $2 trillion in spending, so we'll see what happens with all of that. But being fearful of him rounding people up and putting them in internment camps is ridiculous. But that's the type of fear that some Democrats have decided to instill in the minds of so many Americans, not because they actually believe it. Clearly, they don't believe it, but because they saw it as an effective campaign strategy in lieu of offering their base actual policy goals that would make their lives better.
Sure. Yeah. And, having a measured and accurate campaign, I think, is important for the next campaign. It's going to, like, the 2026 election, I know we just finished with this one, but it's going to be really interesting to see the messaging that happens from the left. Because if they try to come out hard again about Trump being a fascist, I just don't think that's going to play anymore. It didn't play this time.
It's going to be dumb. Yeah, it didn't play this time.
Certainly, they're going to come up with something better.
I think people have caught on to it. So they need to find I mean, how about this? How about actually, maybe considering what your vision for the future of the country is and proposing that as opposed to, you know, uh, trading fear as part of your campaign?
Yeah, I'm sure you guys aren't huge fans of Charlie Kirk, but the campus tour he did over the summer, where he routinely just asked people, what does Kamala here stand for? What's her biggest accomplishment as a politician? Nobody can really answer the question, right? And it isn't necessarily because she didn't have one. Maybe she does. I don't know. But it wasn't ever her message. You know what I mean? It wasn't, here are the 5 things we're going to do for the American people. It's that Trump's a fascist and we're going to stop him. It's like if you think about that from a strategic standpoint, all of your eggs are in that basket. And if any major group of people stops believing in that premise that he's a fascist, then you've lost already. It doesn't, like, there's no granularity at all anymore. Like they're not inspecting you versus him. And you look, one of the things about marketing against an incumbent or a behemoth or a category of one, like against Coca-Cola or Nike or something like that, one of the most important things you can do in marketing is to distinguish yourself from the other guy, right? In whatever way you have to. And just saying they're the evil ones and we're the good ones is not enough. It never works, right? Not for long anyways. It could work on some stupid people for some short amount of time, but it doesn't work very long. I think we need not Republicans and Democrats, but I think we need the right and the left in politics. I think we need people that are responsible, who are trying to push the ball forward, who are trying to defend us. And I think we need people who are empathetic, who are trying to make sure that the least of us are taken care of. We need both of those people, right? Just like we need mom and dad in a fucking household. And if we don't have it, we suffer. And having mom and imagine yourself as a child in a fucking in a home where mom and dad hate each other. That's where we live right now. It's fucked up. It can't continue like this.
I totally agree. And, I get the temptation to want your party to have complete control, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. But I would just say take a good hard look at states that have one party holding dominant control over the entire state. I live in California. Republicans in some areas of the country might be able to get elected into like local office, but overall, in terms of our state legislature and, the powerful positions in California, they're completely controlled by Democrats. I mean, Democrats have a supermajority and they get to do whatever they want. And that lack of tension from another party, I think, has led to a lot of terrible decisions made in the state of California. So I put it in the context of Democrats taking control, or full control. But I would like, some of the more conservative, maybe Republican viewers of your show to maybe consider red states and some of the flaws that we see in the governance there because Republicans have full control. I think it's actually helpful to have the two opposing parties, engage in that tension and also in the negotiation and compromising process in order to ensure that like the best possible solutions are decided on.
Yeah.
When you don't have that tension, really bad decisions get made.
No, and it's true in government and it's true in business as well. Like a really well-functioning business, there will be a constant battle between the marketing team and the finance team. The marketing team saying, I need this much money. And then the finance team saying, well, what are you going to like? Our standard is you turn $1 into $3. If your plan's not doing that, then the answer is no, right? So it requires the people asking for, let's call it subsidies or allotments in government terms, like explain to me exactly how this is making life better. And if you can't, then the answer is fucking no, right? And we just had the DOD fail another audit, 7 in a row. We haven't passed an audit since 2000. I think 2000 was the last one since pre 9/11. It's like, all right, it might be time to fire everybody, right? And get some people that actually have some fucking sense in here.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they can't pass a single audit, yet year after year, we increase the budget for DOD is insane to me. Yeah. Absolutely insane.
Yeah, fuck that. Anyway, so we got to get out of here, bud. I appreciate your time. If I like what you said about conservative folk maybe looking into some other stuff. Like as I talk to people about this all the time, wanting to take care of people is not an intrinsically left or right position. That's a human position, right?
Agreed.
And whether you're a man or a woman, but I would say especially if you're a man, that's your fucking job, is to take care of people and to make sure they're protected. So, you know, you can't be so rigid and inflexible that the right answer sounds wrong to you because it's coming from somebody else. That's a really bad place to find yourself in life. So please listen to this is something I tell people all the time. Just because you don't agree with somebody's solution to a problem doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. And if you behave that way, then a lot of problems are going to go unsolved, and unsolved problems equal human suffering, typically.
Yes,
right?
Totally.
And that is unacceptable in the richest country in the history of the world. So please tell everybody where they can find you, all your shows and all that stuff. You got a lot of stuff going on, so I'll leave it to you.
So I am the executive producer and host of The Young Turks, which you can watch on youtube.com/The Young Turks live Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And I just launched my own Substack. I'm really bad at plugging myself, but I'm going to go ahead and plug that because that's where I write. That's where I, engage in more nuanced content. I bring on voices other than my own to, kind of hash things out and talk about different policy prescriptions. And you can check that out at substack.kasparian.com.
Sweet. Yeah, I'll check that out. I'm working on Substack right now too. It's just I have no time, but people keep asking me for that stuff, so I guess I'll have to do it.
It's fun. I like it.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know much about it yet, so I'm still kind of learning that platform. Well, look, thank you for coming today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Yes, ma'am. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.